Hey, fans of Christianity Without Compromise. I'm Chris Staron, host of the Truce podcast, where this season I'm going through the backstory of how some evangelicals tied themselves to the Republican Party. You can find it at trucepodcast.com or wherever you get podcasts. And now, here's your host, Jake Doberenz.
It's a weirdly across-the-aisle agreement. The United States military, the crowning achievement of our country. Most of us know that our military budget is way larger than anyone else on the world stage. We put a lot into that military. And as I said, whatever side of the aisle you sit on, whatever religion, whatever ideology, most people lift up the military and give them certain respect and certain privileges in some cases. It's a generalization, but we're a pretty pro-military country, and this has very much affected our churches. And uncritically, we embrace the empire ideology that our nation has given us. And as we do on the show, we need to take a good hard look at this idol of militarism and ask ourselves, is this really compatible with the way of Jesus? Today on the show, we have Joshua Schuettenhelm. Joshua served in the military during the Iraq War and bought into Christian nationalism. But nowadays, Joshua is a pacifist who holds the radical nonviolent way of Jesus. In this episode, we are talking about the idol of militarism, how it's taken a hold of American Christianity, and why giving it up might be one of the most faithful things we can do. Welcome to Christianity Without Compromise. In each episode, we explore elements that are central to the Christian faith. Let's get back to the basics. Let's get back to a Christianity without compromise.
It has become an idol in our country, like especially kind of since World War I, but definitely after World War II was where it became a real big, I believe, an American part of our core identity.
Yeah, man, I was raised in the public school system. It's kind of, it's a part of the system you grow up in. It's just the air you breathe.
Right.
It's really,
war.
yeah, they're really interesting. Well, I taught early American U.S. history, so I didn't get into that crazy stuff necessarily, but it's very interesting coming from the teaching perspective and the student perspective. It's like, what are we teaching kids here sometimes? Okay.
Oh yeah, my daughter came home from school. Okay, so we live a few miles from the Lockheed Martin F-35 assembly plant for the F-35, and some of the engineers or whatever from that plant came to our daughter's school, visited, and like showed off. She came home with these flyers about how great the engineering was on the F-35. I'm like, oh my gosh, I threw it in the trash. I'm like, you don't need this.
Yeah,
it was part of a STEM program. In all fairness, it was part of a STEM program about the cool jobs you can have in science and technology and stuff. It's like, but it definitely wasn't something that I felt like,
right. Cool stuff, but it's like, what are they going to be used for again? Oh yeah, right. That's right.
Yeah.
Well, I want to jump in here because we got some really cool stuff to explore, and we're going to dive into those same topics in just a little bit. So I want to start with kind of a young Joshua. Why did you join the military? What were you told about it? What did you believe about what you were doing back in those days?
Well, it wasn't really discussed much in our home growing up. Well, my uncle had been in the Army. I have very faint memories of him, but he died in a training accident. My mom kind of associated, that was the kind of negative association she had with it. But otherwise, my main association was with the movie Sergeant York, which I saw as a young child. And I loved that movie. The whole idea of being a hero, and but also in his case, he was a Christian, so he kind of blended those together. And there's a scene in there where it says, God, country, and he figured out a way to blend both together into what we'd call Christian nationalism today. But but I didn't know the term back then, and it was one of those things. But what was I told? Again, I wasn't really told much until I guess after 9/11. That became more of a core part. I was 18, I guess, when 9/11 happened, and of course watching the invasion of Afghanistan, to a certain degree, but then definitely after watching the shock and awe of Iraq. I don't know if you're old enough to remember that, but the shock and awe campaign of Iraq, and it was definitely like, it was something at the time in my circle where we were. It's like, this is great. We're going to get those bad guys. We're going to get those weapons of mass destruction, bring democracy to the people of Iraq, and that was the thinking at the time. One of the reasons I joined the Army, something that has not changed with my personality or character, I guess. The application has changed a lot over the years, but my concern for those on the margins, and that's something that I believe has always been the core part of my identity. I'll never forget when Pearl Harbor came out. I had to watch the movie, and I would like ask my mom, "Hey, let's go rent this movie." We went to Blockbuster. We rented the movie Pearl Harbor, and the one line in that movie that really resonated with me was where Josh Hartnett, his character Danny, I believe he's writing a letter to, I think it was Evelyn, his girlfriend. And he's saying, when bullies arise, it is up to those who can to defend those who cannot stand up for themselves. And that was a line that I probably botched it up, but it really resonated with me. That idea of standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. And again, my application has changed a lot over the years, but I believe that is part of what got me into the military, is also part of what got me out.
Yeah, we'll get to that story, I promise, because there is a rest to the story there.
Right.
But yeah, thank you for sharing that, and it's really interesting how movies impacted your journey there. That's really curious. I was not a war movie watcher; like that's just not the movies I watched growing up. But yeah, even like the superhero movies and stuff that I was watching, like they have a certain level of the hero and saving people, and you gotta stop the bad guys at any cost, kind of thing. Yeah, very interesting the ways in which media molds us, for sure. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about this buzzword of the episode here. I mean, we got militarism. You mentioned Christian nationalism as well here, and there's some relation there. But, I mean, how did militarism become such a looming idol in America, and especially in these Christian circles? Why is it so powerful?
Okay, this is something I've given a lot of thought to over the years. I think it comes down to two things: greed and fear. Greed, insofar as there's big money to be made in military weaponry. Like the U.S. leads the world in military weapons exports, actually personal weapons exports as well, rifles and Winchester, all that stuff. But we're talking about military here. Military grade weapons, we export more than any other country. That's our number one export, is in terms of we export more weapons than we do anything else. Make more money off of that than anything else. But one of the questions that drove me, that started like nagging at me, is when I was when I first started digging into this, is why weapons? Why not, like, we could invest that same money towards housing or better ways to grow food for other countries, or water filtration. There's so many other things we could be investing towards, which in a rising tide lifts all ships. It could help all of us. Well, Matthew Desmond, I read his book, and it was helpful with part of that, because the very top crust of society will actually benefits from the poverty of those on the bottom. But I think the other aspect of that is fear, because fear is a heck of a motivator, and this is where Christians have an opportunity to separate themselves from society, because the U.S. is, I refer to it as an empire, and empires thrive on fear. They thrive on like fear, like in the U.S., the irrational fear of being taken over militarily, which I don't think very many people actually have that much of a military fear over that, but because they trust in the military might. Saw a little bit of that on Flag Day on June 14th with the Trump's birthday parade and all that. But there's a reason why the most commonly repeated command in Scripture is "do not fear," and if I think Rick Warren said 365 times. I'm not sure. I've never counted, but I'll take his word for it. I know it's the most repeated command in Scripture, and there's a reason for that, because God knew that it would be something. It's something empires impose on us, and there's nothing that unites a society or unites a subculture, for that matter, like a good enemy. You see this with the Democrats versus Republicans. The Republicans against, if your team is the only one that can save the country, and the other half is trying to destroy it, it becomes a good way to stay in power and raise funds. It's And then in among Christian circles, you can wrap that up with flowery language of sacrifice and valor and heroism and the greatest atrocities in the world, like carpet bombing, essentially Japan, and then nuking Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Things like that can be justified because God's on our side. Bob Dylan, if you want to take use his terminology. So we as a church culture have wrapped ourselves around and tied ourselves to the power of the empire. Just like yeah, we can go through church history and see where that has never turned out well.
Yeah, definitely never turned out well.
Yeah.
I love it though. Your two identification, the two things you identify there, greed and fear, which is something that Christians are not supposed to be for, but they're both weirdly almost like accepted sins, and
Right.
I don't know. It's really interesting, and we both have a mutual acquaintance in Dr. Malcolm Foley and his book Anti-Greed Gospel,
Yes.
which talks about both of those things, specifically the greed part, and
Right.
talks about what empires do, not great things.
Right.
And so I love your analysis there. I think that really makes sense. And those are traps that Christians fall for, of the greed part of it, and wanting to be safe because of fear of whoever
Right.
whoever's the enemy of the month, kind of thing. Like
Right.
we're scared of them coming over and getting us or something. So
Mm-hmm.
if we just have the biggest guns in the world, which we do like a bajillion times over,
Right.
um,
Plus
then
two
we'll be
oceans.
safe. Yeah,
Plus two oceans. We have the Pacific and
right.
the
That's
Atlantic.
true.
That
Good
kind of
point.
separates us from. Yeah, we're not
Right.
in danger of being militarily taken over, unless we invade China or something. Then they, which I don't know. I haven't put that out of the possibility either. That's something that hopefully will never happen. But it's
Yeah,
definitely
exactly.
it's a very real possibility that some of those at the top are pushing for.
Yes,
So
yes, for sure. Well, I saw the Red Dawn remake, and I hope that doesn't happen. So,
that's it's a realistic scenario, unfortunately.
mm, yeah, that's. Woo, well, we're not talking about that, and we're not advocating for fear, of course, because that's
Right,
what we just said
absolutely.
is
Yeah.
bad. We don't want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I like again, I appreciate your analysis there. I appreciate you talking about why we've become so entangled with kind of military and militarism. Now let's talk about your journey. You're in Iraq, you have this military career, it begins to unravel. You encounter the ugliness of war, not even just in the fighting part, but like in the structure of the military. So, talk to us about how that career came to an end and kind of how you developed your views today.
Yeah. This is a long time. It took a long time for me to fully wrap all this up because I actually got out of the army. Then I had a year and a half break, and then I joined the Air Force Reserves, and that's another story. But and to be fair to I know you interviewed Natalie. Her experience with the military and mine are very, very different. Like she was in combat arm. She's in what did she say she was? Um, Infantry, I believe she said. Anyway,
Hmm.
I was a mechanic for the first my first deployment. Then I was a chaplain assistant. I changed jobs. I became a chaplain assistant. So I've had some encounters with incoming missiles and stuff like that, but I've never actually fired a weapon in combat. I've never had some of the trauma inducing experiences that she had, or and many just like her have had. And so I was fortunate in that regard, but I did see uh, one of the big things that really changed my perspective on this was the military contractors. And I recommend probably the most realistic movie about the Iraq War was the movie War Dogs. It's classified as a comedy, but I did not find it funny at all. It's about essentially the contracting um, aspect of the war, which really drove the support for the things. Like anything that soldiers needed, anything that any military member needed, was provided by KBR or a subcontract of KBR, and in that was a lot of exploited people from either Iraq there or flown in from India or Pakistan. Like people from other countries were flown in. I don't know about Pakistan, Ghana, I know for sure. Uh, to and wash our laundry, cook our food, all that stuff, and they were paid like not much at all compared to, like, say, the contractors who, were in charge of them were, making 6 digits tax free. Most of it's tax free. And um, but I guess, and then also watching the military members themselves get exploited. Watching, like, um, and one of the big things that made me leave the army, never go back to the army, was watching how soldiers get um, put on levels. Like, if you do not max out your fitness and your um, weapons qualifications, you are, like, not worth anything to the unit, and the rules apply to you differently depending on how well you do on those, how well you look and how well you know carry yourself as a, with your role and whatever.
And where did the focus on nonviolence, where did that come into play?
That kind of, okay. So my first deployment to Iraq, I started seeing, okay, we did not invade Iraq for the reasons that I've been told we invaded it for, and so I kind of came away from that with idea that, okay, we did this for the wrong reasons. We're doing things that are wrong, but it is up to us um, to now clean up our mess and hopefully learn from this mistake. And I guess it classifies more as a mistake, and um, I don't know, put the most positive spin I could have on it, but it's still, I opposed. I became over time became opposed to the Iraq War, but we need to stay and complete what we started. At least set them up with a, functioning government. How I got to the well, actually, it was embarrassing, but several years later, is actually Hurricane Ian was in when it hit Florida a few years ago. Was when I really started getting serious about the nonviolence aspect. As I read a book by Malcolm Gladwell called Bomber Mafia, and he gives more into the details of how about aerial bombing. And at this point, I was a F-16 crew chief. I was a F-16 fighter jet maintenance technician, essentially, and that's what we do. It's what not what we do. I deployed to Saudi Arabia at one point, but things were calm when I was there. We didn't actually drop any bombs while I was there, but uh, but that's what those planes are designed to do. And so I was so reading the book, I had that in my mind. This is what this is designed to do, to basically drop bombs on people. That's something that had bothered me. It kind of in the back of my mind had dug in me for a while, especially when you start realizing that most victims of bombing are civilians. Like recently, the so this is something that really annoyed me recently was the signals chat leak. We were making such a big deal about how they were not careful about the classified information, blah blah blah. Then you look at the chats and you realize, okay, so they're celebrating. You look at what was actually in the chat. You realize they were applauding the bombing of an apartment building to kill one dude. Meanwhile, 56 other people died that day. People that just living their life in an apartment building that should still be alive, but they're not. I never like really put it all together and faced it until we were doing a training exercise. Well, the pilots were doing a training exercise. We were there to support, make sure the planes were airworthy and all that stuff. So we flew to Florida for that. And in the middle of, well, because the hurricane, we went to go into Tyndall Air Force Base. And Tyndall Air Force Base is right by Panama City. And early on, okay, long story short, the hurricane was going to make a sharp turn to the right and actually to the east and hit, I forget where it hit, Fort Myers or something like that. Anyway, made a sharp turn, hit the west coast of Florida, like roughly 100 miles or so away from Panama City. So I guess our leadership felt like it was safe to go to Panama City. Well, a lot of people had evacuated Panama City, and it was just a madhouse trying to get on a plane. And we were flying commercial, and being military, we took priority over other people that, in my opinion, should have been taking priority. And meanwhile, I bought this book at the bookstore there, and I'm reading it about how we transitioned from early in the war to trying to do precision bombing to, that failed. So we decided we can, whatever carpet bombing the British were doing, we could do it better. And so we did a bigger, better, whatever, destroyed more than they did, carpet bombed essentially every city in Japan with the exception of the the royal capital and the few cities we earmarked for the as potential nuclear targets. And I'm reading this. I finished it. By the time we got to Florida, I'd finished this book, and I was like just devastated with really realizing this is the good war, that quote unquote the good war, and here we were just killing civilians by the hundreds of thousands, and we don't talk about this. We just talk about the the good things that happened because of the war. We talk about the Nazi concentration camps that were liberated, and okay, that's all fine and good, but look at what we did in the meantime, which did not actually advance the war effort. We didn't. That did not win us the war. That was where I really started getting serious about. Okay, this is what is my part as a Christian in all this, and what am I doing here? And I guess that's where it all came together. I said, okay, I can't do this anymore. So.
Yeah, that is that would be quite the revelation, especially for being somebody working with the military to be like, oh no, that makes sense. The wrestling you'd have to do with all of that, and I know a part of your journey is looking at some of the early church stuff. I mean, we talk about this on the show a lot, so I don't feel like we need to rehash it completely. But the early church had a very different relationship with violence and empire, right?
Yes, they did.
Very different.
Very different. That's one. Okay, so that's part of it. Was like was I was in seminary at the time. I was starting seminary, and I chose that as my capstone thesis. I said, okay, I'm going to look for. I realized someone. I think it was Shane Claiborne was the first person I saw who said that what he's saying, that the early church was unanimously opposed to violence. Is like that can't be right. The early church was not unanimous on anything, on much of anything. There was very few things that they were unanimous on, and that could not be right. Well, I read it in I think Brian Zahn of it, and it's like, okay, I got to dig into this. So that was part of my capstone thesis, and I realized the same thing you're saying, that everyone, okay, except for a brief, like really small quote by Ambrose, everyone before Augustine, literally everyone before Constantine, were opposed, that spoke on the topic, were opposed to violence. And that was like that was another big part of my, okay, what has happened to us as a society, and how have we lost our mission? Like and this is where, you dig deeper into why they were opposed to violence. They realized Jesus had come in to start a new kingdom, a kingdom that did not, not violence, not they were the poor or, not exploited. Jesus came, and they felt their call to live up to that kingdom, even though technically it didn't exist yet. It was still part of the Roman Empire, where all those things were still happening, but they modeled it in a way that we do not do today.
Yeah, I mean, Jesus' kingdom was not of this world. They were playing by different rules. It was not the geopolitical nation that needs to be protected with fighter jets and bombs and missiles and things. It was just such a different thing. And, I find sometimes one argument against that I hear is like, oh, well, they just didn't have the power to take over the Roman Empire. That's why they didn't. That's the real reason. It just wouldn't have been effective, kind of thing. But I don't buy that, because you're right. It's like basically unanimous. It wasn't an effective thing. It was their values.
Yeah. And if you look at Constantine's just war theory, read what he actually said about it, and look at literally every war the U.S. has fought. And I'm not an expert on the history of other wars, but the U.S. has never ever fought a war on just war principles. As Augustine framed them, and actually they were framed before him. He didn't invent the idea. He just put a Christian wrapping on it, and that was big. That's a big part of my position now, is like realizing that even if, like, I believe if St. Augustine was here today, I believe that he would retract his just war theory. If he could be planted here today, put him in a library for like a few days where he could like look at all the history of how his principles are put in action or used to justify the things that his ideas are used to justify. I think he would retract it all.
Yeah,
I'm convinced of that.
I gotta believe that too. I mean, I would hope so.
Because in his and I look at it this way, like in his context, the church is just now starting to unite with the empire. I can see from his perspective where the potential of, like, in theory, his ideas were good. Maybe war is necessary at times, and I can see where he might have thought that at least. Actually, there's another book I could talk about called Civil Resistance, where she makes a case where no, uh, nonviolent resistance actually has a better track record than violent resistance, but
Totally.
we don't talk about that. Mm.
Yeah, no, totally. I love it. I love it. I like that. Well, maybe one day when we invent time travel, we can go talk to Saint Augustine, Saint Augustine, however you want to say it, and
Right,
straighten them out. But
right.
for now, in the present, like, let's get a little practical here. So, one of the things we do on the show is, we talk about these idols, these distractions, these hangups, and today we're talking about militarism. How do we smash it? What does it look like to get rid of this idol of militarism in our own context, in our own lives, especially for Christians living in a culture that glorifies violence and conquest and has really awkwardly intertwined faith with fighting?
Okay, the numbers don't lie. The military, just by the numbers, look, if you take the Bible out of this, you take our moral qualms about it. Just looking at the numbers, the military is a great, probably the most attractive career option for most, you know, high school graduates, because like, you think about all the benefits. Medical benefits alone are better than any benefits I know of. 30 days paid leave, 36 months of free education that you can transfer to your children if you want to, or you can use it yourself. Um, by the time a typical member finishes his first or her first enlistment, they are far enough into the career that any competing employment would come with at least a temporary pay cut. This is before I really started digging deep into this. But I went to church one day, and this guy was like, he was beaming with pride. He's like, "Hey, I understand you're in the Air Force. Someone told me you're in the Air Force." I'm like, "Yes." And he's like, "Hey, talk to my son. My son's going to join the Air Force." I'm like, "Okay." And I'm not convinced this is a good idea for him, but And so I talked to this kid, and this kid had absolutely no clue. But his dad was like beaming with pride about this, and and I think part of that is, sadly, parents maybe, again, fear of their kids not being able to make it through school. Maybe they fear of their finances, what happens with their finances. If, they can't put their kids through, they can't pay for their kids to go through school. Maybe student loans are can be ridiculous. And college is very expensive, and the military is offering to pay for that. So that's one fear taken off the table. That's money. That's greed and fear. I feel like a broken record talking about greed and fear all the time when I raise this topic up. But um, but then I think for those of us that are, with those that are in the military, it might mean, on a practical level, it might mean taking a pay cut, because once you've been in the military long enough, you've worked your way up. You might make. By the time I was in Air Force Reserves, and by the time I left, I was Air Force Reserve, but also full time employed with the full Air Force Reserves, making $41 an hour, and I don't make anywhere near that much now. I had to get a certification, which the Air Force did not require. To get a called airframe and power plant license to work on it. I work on the American Eagle planes now, for American Airlines, and I make a lot less money now, and it hurts. There's a sting about that, especially when 3 kids and stuff. It's something I've had to work with. But Dr. Martin Luther King, he said something very profound. He said that we need to be as creative in prevention of violence as we are in currently perpetuating it. So something to that effect. I need to look up the exact quote. But I've joined an organization called Veterans for Peace, and we talk about this a lot, about how we can creatively engage and preventing, and emailing a congressman, calling a congresspeople and stuff. Code Pink is a similar organization, but I think only for ladies, and they get very creative. They're very active. Brian Wilson is a book I read called "Don't Thank Me for My Service." He was part of a group of activists who were blocking the shipment of bombs. I forget which war it was that they were needing bombs for, but Brian Wilson and his was leading a group in opposition to this, a rail yard, and one day the train engineer was told to just push through and go faster, and they caught these guys by surprise, and he actually he fell. He was trying to get away from the train, and he didn't get away with it. The train ran over his legs. He now has fake prosthetic legs, but he was a Vietnam veteran. But slightly less practical, and I think something that we as a collective, we as a society, even if you are not in the military, we all benefit from the military-industrial complex. We are like we all drive cars. Our gas prices are far lower than they otherwise would be. We my third deployment was to Saudi Arabia. We were there to keep clear the Strait of Hormuz, I believe, and just to keep that flow of oil going. So the oil companies, that U.S. based oil companies that were there could continue to making their profits and all that. Like I think 80%, some ridiculous. I don't have the numbers handy. I'm not going to start lying on about this, but a large percentage of the world's oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz, and I think a large percentage of that goes to China. Very little of it comes to the U.S. anymore, but we still benefit with low gas prices. We are like Fort Worth, for example, would become a ghost town without make Detroit look like a boomtown. With if all the military industrial complex that's here in Fort Worth, Texas, were to shut down, this city would be like a complete the economy would die. No question about it. As a society, collective repentance is something big in the Bible. I have never fired a weapon in combat, but I still feel like I'm part of the system. I benefited from it. I'm partially responsible. I love that song. One of my favorite songs, I'm going to out myself here, is What I've Done by Linkin Park. And if you watch the video, you might get a better idea of where I'm coming from in my interpretation of the song. It's essentially like the video shows clips of nuclear testing, Vietnam, things that happened before most of those singers on that video were born. But the song is about what I've done, and even though technically none of them had actually done any of that, but we as a society are guilty, and if God still judges nations, we have a lot to answer for.
Wow, you're giving us tons to chew on there for sure, and I think it makes sense to also talk about the ways in which our society is built around the military. And I like your Martin Luther King quote, like, we got to get creative here. Like,
Right.
it's going to be creative, to create alternatives to replace this, because the reality is, a lot of young people are joining the military because those benefits are fantastic, and whole economies in local areas depend on the military. And to do without that would change things, and that's scary. That's scary to think about.
Right.
I half thought when you were talking about all the benefits of the military, I thought you were going to say, and so the church needs to step in and replace that. And I think a lot of
Oh,
churches and their budgets would get really freaked out about that.
yes.
Fair enough, fair enough. But
Mhm.
man, how can we think creatively in alternative ways to say, hey, this doesn't have to be the only option here. There are other things to do, and it does mean wrestling with. Back to the beginning, right? Wrestling with our fear and wrestling with our greed is the way forward here. We have to really consider that, and then to your point about collective repentance. Also, not everybody's favorite thing to do, to think about the
Right.
ways we're complicit in systems much larger than ourselves,
Hmm.
but very important and incredibly biblical. Um, Man, I was just preaching through some of the prophetic literature in the Old Testament, and it just that's a part of the culture. It's the society as a whole. They have sinned because their values got off track, and God has to shake them and say, "Get back on track. You guys have ignored the most important commands," which were a lot of the complaints that God had in that literature was they weren't treating the poor and the marginalized correctly. They had a culture of violence where they were killing people, and also they had a culture of greed where they were unfairly charging people and just kind of focused a little too much on money and bribing judges and things like that. So, yeah, nothing new under the sun, right? But the way forward is to repent of those things. So, great. Okay, we've talked a lot and had a really good journey here. I want to, before we get to that last final question that every guest gets, I want to give you some space right now to just kind of talk about what projects are you working on. Leave us with any last wisdom. Where can we find your upcoming book and things like that.
Yeah, I'm working on. I'm working on a book. It's called Dogmatic Uncertainty, and it starts out with the certainty that I had growing up, and with very dogmatic certainty, but also uncertainty about the state of our souls, and about just any little thing. Are we doing right? Are we pleasing God? All that. It was a lot of paranoia, a lot of fear. Again, and as I go over, I got away from that, went to different kinds of fundamentalism, and again, military, and the evangelical echo chamber, where that is all tied in together. And now a more dogmatic uncertainty, where I'm dogmatic about the things that matter. I believe I've my beliefs have dwindled in numbers. The things I'm willing to be dogmatic about have dwindled in number, but I'm that much more certain of those things. But I'm also comfortable with the uncertainty of not knowing of some of the secondary issues that tend to divide us. But I'm also, again, where I was all for tying ourselves to the military, making that was a core part of my identity. Um, and now it's obviously no longer. Um, the parable of the sheep and the goats is something I talk about a lot. If you grew up in the '90s, you'd know about the what would Jesus do, and that's something that used to be very a
Sure.
driving part of my quest was doing what Jesus would do, blah blah, while ignoring what Jesus actually said on that topic. Reading the sheep and the goats, you know, through new eyes, has become a big part of a big part of my journey. Because Jesus did not say, "Go feed the hungry," because that's what I would do. He did not say, "Go feed the hungry," because that's what I did. He said, "I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty. I was naked. I was prisoner. I was a stranger." And so, a big aha moment for me was when I was working with the homeless. I was volunteering at the Union Gospel Mission, and then later again, seeing that we experienced this again working as a chaplain intern at Baylor Hospital, and seeing and meeting Jesus on the street, in looking at those people and thinking, this is Jesus coming at me in the form of a hungry person, a person that's homeless, a person that's sick, lived his whole life fighting his alcohol addiction. His liver shot, and might die, whatever, things like that. Just this is seeing Jesus already there waiting for me has been a very liberating experience.
Yeah, I like that. That is a good thing. I didn't think about that. I've always been kind of, I don't know if scared is the right word, but Matthew 25 is intense. It's like, oh, okay. That's what actually matters. All right.
Yeah.
We'll be sure to put your books and stuff in the show note. Your book, Dogmatic Uncertainty, which should come out soonish around the time when this episode comes out. So that should be perfect. And there's so much of your journey that we didn't really explore today. Like, we scratched the surface, so you can check out that book to
Right.
get the rest of the story. Very exciting.
Yes, thank you.
Well, we got one final question that everybody gets asked. This is the time for the practical punch, the thing we can carry forward, the one thing if everybody forgets everything in this episode, which hopefully they don't. This is where you get that final word here. So, as we close, leave the audience with just one practical action they can do this week to live out their faith fully for Jesus.
Practical action. I stole this idea from Justin Early. I forget, A Common Rule, I think, is the name of the book. And what he recommended, because typically nowadays we use our phones as our alarm clocks. At his suggestion, I went to Walmart. I think I paid $5 for one of those red numbered alarm clocks. Very simple. All it has is a time and the alarm. And I wake up to that and leave my phone out of reach, so that it's not the first thing I reach for in the morning. It's not, I can spend some time. I don't have that impulse like within arm's reach. So that's, I guess, if I had to pick one practical thing that, like, just to start the day off right. Once you can start the day off with Jesus and start the day off on that calm, like, don't have hurried way we typically start our mornings. We don't.
Yeah,
There's a better way
speaking
to
of
do it.
idols, we got that phone that can
Yes, we
be
do.
a really common
Yes.
addiction and idol for people. Uh-oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
No, I like it. That's a really great practical action. I like it to center ourselves right when we wake up and to focus on more important things. That's really cool. Well, you recommended a lot of great books and things for us today. Also, I was going to mention, you mentioned earlier the episode with Natalie Drew. We talk about Christian identity and transgenderism on that episode, but we also do touch a little bit on violence and her journey in that space too. So that's another recommendation for everybody. But I like to end the episode with a sharing challenge of who should you share this episode with? And today, because so many books were mentioned, I want to say share this with a book nerd friend of yours, somebody who likes to read, because Joshua gave us so many reading recommendations today, and
like to read.
several that I'm going to have to add to my list. And you can check out the show notes. We're going to try to get all of them in there too, so we can all read what you're reading. But Joshua Schuettenhelm, thank you so much for being on the show and talking about militarism and talking about your journey and all this. It was so great to have you today.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. And everybody else out there in podcast land, don't forget to, subscribe, rate, and review and all that fun stuff. And I told you who to share it with, so, be sure to share it with one of your book nerd friends. Thanks, everybody. Thank you for listening to Christianity Without Compromise. We just had a great episode, and don't forget to share that with all of your friends and your enemies. I encourage you to subscribe to us on Substack at jakedoberenz.substack.com. There you will find this show as well as our Friday newsletter. We want to create a space to get back to Jesus, and that community is a great one to be a part of. This episode was recorded by me, Jake Doberenz, in conjunction with Theophany Media. We are also members of the Kingdom First Ministries Broadcasting Network. Check them out at kfmbroadcasting.com. You guys are the best audience in the world, so go put into practice the wisdom and advice you got from this episode, and let's make the world a little bit more like Jesus. Thank you.